all of you for this next part of the Onward event, a masterclass on design codes, no less. Thank you all for attending. It's very difficult for presenters these days to know their audience and have that sort of connection, but I'm sure we're all pretty used to how we connect with social media, and we're looking forward to an interactive session on this particular topic. So I'm going to just give a very brief introduction and hand over to our speaker, and we will conclude at 5 to 12. Firstly, just by way of introduction to myself, I'm Head of Architecture at the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. As with all civil servants, we work busily in the background, and my job is really focused on design quality and standards in places and homes right across the department, but also more specifically these days in the planning department, given the agenda there. So design codes, a particularly prescient and appropriate subject to be talking about. You'll be aware that design codes has prominence in the government's planning white paper, Planning for the Future, rather. And we're in the process, as most of you will know, in developing a national model design code, which I'll say a little bit more about. But first, to my speaker, who better placed, I think, to run a masterclass on this subject than Ben Bolgar. A pleasure to welcome you, Ben. I won't repeat in detail what's in his biography, which you can all access, but it's a pretty impressive CV on the subject. He will be familiar to most of you. He's a fellow architect, senior director at Prince's Foundation, and has led over 40 award-winning projects for the Prince's Foundation over the last 25 years, ranging in scale from urban extensions to strategies and projects, and most significantly, I suppose, working with local stakeholders and using design codes for many of them. So he has particularly pioneered some aspects of community engagement in development, and has a particular model that is beneficial, I think, to developing design codes, which I'm sure he'll talk about. He has a unique experience because just recently, Ben will be able to expand on that, but he is now partner in the development company. So quite uniquely, he has a perspective on this from not just a consultant, a landowner, and a community perspective, but also a developer's perspective. So we look forward to hearing that range of experience. So he's going to talk about his experience using specific case studies. I'd be particularly interested to understand some of the aspects of community engagement, how you measure support for that, how councils can be using design codes more closely to drive up quality in their area, which of course is my subject. A few words about the policy context. We're working with consultants to develop the National Model Design Code, and it's to be applied in the current planning system. It will be launched later this year for public consultation, so you all have a good opportunity to comment on it. It sets out design parameters for well-designed places in more detail, and for different types of development at different scales and with different character areas. And it will set a process out for making design codes, for model, for community engagement, and as you know, will play potentially a much wider role in a future rules-based planning system, which has been proposed. So we have the benefit of colleagues from Create Streets and from Ben and from other members of the Building Better Commission report contributing their thoughts to it. So a very extensive consultation process. So I'm just here to listen to what Ben has to say rather than talk about what's going on in the ministry. I really look forward to what Ben's going to be telling us about, and we'll be taking some of that learning back, I'm sure. I just urge you, before you start, to prepare questions as we go along. Just be aware of the chat function, I'll be coming back with some of the questions that you might be posing to Ben, peppered with a few of my own. And we'll give Ben the floor right now. So over to you, Ben. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andy. And see whether I can fire this up. Okay. Good. Well, thank you very much, Andy. I thought I would just cover really the practical approach to coding. And it's a sort of series of war stories, if you like, of having been involved in detail with specifically three codes for large projects, large urban extensions, one public sector, one private sector, and one for a long-term landowner, and hopefully draw from each. Before I get started, really the question I think many people might be asking is, can we actually change building culture through design coding? I think it's fair to say the default setting at the moment is fairly low and uniformity is prevalent. So can coding enhance quality, diversity, and good repetition? The housing industry is quite slow to change because it's fairly easy at the moment to sell a house. So can coding transfer best practice? Construction code, very importantly, because it's essentially like an outline specification, you can set build standards through that, and so level the playing field for land bids, which obviously need to be adjusted for various sales prices across the country. Coding, importantly, can enhance meaningful local identity. If that's what communities want and find important, can that actually make places that fit into the local context? Just general best practice in building, I think, is important, and obviously sustainability techniques. At its very simplest, sort of definition, it's a set of graphic instructions of how to build a place. They're often called form-based codes because the ones we've been involved with actually focus on the physical form rather than specifically land use, but obviously land use is a key part of that. And really it's about emphasizing the public realm. So most codes that we've worked on, the ones I'm showing you, don't get into the building regulations inside the buildings. They tend to deal primarily with the public realm. And actually design coding, when you engage communities, we found it to be incredibly positive. It's actually involving how they think a new place could be designed and what it might look like and where it might go. And I think, you can build trust if local communities actually see, as I'll come on to in the last case study, something that they like and they feel they've been listened to, then it creates an incredibly good level of trust with the local community. So most people will be familiar with this diagram. We've been zoning for 70, 80 years, but we've been zoning things separately by land uses. I think the design coding, or certainly design coding I'm going to be talking about, is how you integrate the different components of building to make a public space. So the bottom part of the diagram is really what we're trying to make, streets and squares where you have integrated buildings. And of course, design coding isn't new. There are all over the world different examples of design coding. One of my particular favourites is the code to address the Fire of London, which got formalised 100 years or so later in the Black Act, as it's called, the 1774 London Building Act. And there, at its simplest sense, you had a set of building regulations to stop buildings burning down, stopping people putting too many twiddly bits on the outsides of buildings that could catch fire. And you have 4 house rates. And the whole of London, and indeed a lot of the UK, has got this very, very simple set of house plans and house elevations that have stood the test of time. So here is a 4th-rate house, the smallest of those examples, that's been lovingly restored quite recently, and that stood the test of time for a good 250 years. And this is, I think, what we're trying to address, which is the default setting of uniformity. I think the point is, if you repeat things that are good, uniformity and repetition could become a good thing. If you're repeating things that aren't so good, then obviously repetition isn't great. So I don't think we should fear repetition, but we should just make sure that any repetition is done well. Just to go through the case studies now, and I'll try and rattle through these. So back in the day, this was English Partnerships. And at Upton, an urban extension to Northampton for around about 7,000 homes on the west side on the main dual carriageway going out of Northampton. The first phase was about 1,100 homes to the southeast, and we wrote with EDOR, as they then were, a design code and carried out inquiry by design community engagement. So it was quite innovative. I think at the time the code covered things like street hierarchy, sustainable urban drainage, which was quite novel, the building types and the building materials. We didn't really engage, we did engage the community in the vision of the plan, but in terms of the characterization, I remember, this was before digital cameras, herring around on a motorbike with a zoom lens and actually trying to characterize the best bits of Northampton, and that went into the code. I think what happened was a bit of a nightmare. We created a monster in that there were different character types, some Victorian, some Regencies, some modern buildings, and the first developer, Paul Newman, actually did a real jumble. So it got very, very confusing. And Paul said to us, look, if you're confused, why don't you help us? So we said, right, can we just have all of the simple Regency terraces down the main street and make a more formal street? And so that was with formal suds, formal planting, relatively formal buildings. And then let's do the arts and crafts buildings on the rural street, which was, in that case, happened to be a horse trail that threaded its way through the development. So on the next street along, you had the more arts and craftsy type buildings. And then on the tertiary streets, this is all within the same block. That's one of the SUDS systems on the rural street. And then this is a more hard landscape muse. So what we learned from that was, in a way, to keep it simple, the danger is if you create too many character zones and the developer jumbles up the house types as if they've sort of sneezed on them, then it feels awful. I think if there's a formality or informality or urban to rural, then it's much more successful because the whole thing's just much calmer and easier, and also easier to build. That muse is relatively easy to build and pretty successful. And again, some little local characteristics in Northampton. You get divided upper sashes, and so there are little nuances. So putting larger buildings, apartment buildings, on key spots within the plan. In this case, a hard urban edge overlooking the park, the country park. And again, this was all relating to the same code, some more traditional buildings. I think this is HTA doing some more contemporary buildings with upper floor living overlooking the park, which are pretty successful and popular. And again, these were all of the buildings were BREEAM Excellent. So you can see here there's some more traditional BREEAM Excellent buildings and some more contemporary. I think this street we looked at and thought it was a little bit jumbled, and how well do the styles sit together compared to the sort of previous one where it's just a bit more elegant. So again, we're learning quite a lot about neighbourliness and how the buildings relate to one another across the down a street, if you like. And Bill Dunster did the first Code 6 homes, which again had to conform to the code. And we got into some very interesting discussions about should everything face south and how do you make a great place, turning the corner, etc. So it was a really successful, I think, first 3 phases. Unfortunately, the code was then diluted. I think the code maybe set too high, all the standards with BREEAM Excellent, 1.5 car parking spaces, which was a bit unrealistic at the time. There were an awful lot of standards set by English partnerships that I think affected the land value. And so the code was relaxed a bit, and then the next phases looked like that. So I think anyone that visits Upton, and I would urge you to do so, you can see a definite break between where I think everybody lost their nerve. And I think if they'd set the standards and looked at the viability early on and worked with developers more closely, then maybe everyone would have been able to hold their nerve. The next one I want to cover, the cover is Sherford. This is the eastern expansion to Plymouth for about 7,000 homes. And this was a relatively young group of promoters who then ended up doing a deal with a consortium of volume house builders. And we were involved in both the master planning, the community engagement. We managed to get 3,000 objectors down to 1 in a couple of years and set a design code for that development. The code here was a little bit more innovative in that we'd learnt quite a lot from Upton. And I remember thinking that the recipe book was an absolutely unbelievably genius invention by Mrs. Beaton, I think it was, which essentially took people like me who aren't terribly talented at cooking, but provided you follow a simple set of instructions, you can actually produce pretty good food. And I think That's what we're trying to do. Is we're not trying to turn everybody in the country into a genius architect or a genius urban planner. We're trying to take mass house building, which is relatively straightforward and relatively simple, and make it a lot better. And of course, in the 18th and 19th century, that's what they were doing. It was these wonderful towns, which we now cherish, were largely built by speculative builders, not by incredible architects. So to my mind, the recipe is quite a good analogy. And of course, recipes have a series of standards, a series of ingredients, and most importantly, on the right, they tell you how to put things together and in what sequence, which of course is very, very important. The code is split into three. You have generic standards, which is really the town-wide regulations. That's more familiar to most people, that things you submit with an outline planning application. Part two are the specific ingredients, the thing that you make the town from. And then part three are the instructions of how you put the whole thing together. Again, I'll just go through some of those key drawings. So you have the key fixes plan, fixing the main routes, the local centres, the school sites, for instance. Then you have the legibility plan, which is quite important. This shows you sight lines, with the main streets tend to be longer and straighter sight lines, secondary streets less. Then you have a street hierarchy, primary, secondary and tertiary streets. Land uses and land use planning, which is obviously pretty important to make sure you get the mixed uses. The landscape plans, landscape standards, these always look like the nicest drawings, and you can see the water routes and bat flight corridors. And in this case, we've made sure that the town finished is the eastern side of Plymouth, even though it crosses the boundary into the South Hams. And we made sure that urban sprawl was resisted by creating a 200-hectare country park, which is now planted up as the town is developing. You can do energy and resource standards, again, rules of thumb for addressing sustainability, like roof pitches, for instance, on different orientations of streets. And this is really key. I just want to pause here for a minute, because building materials, as I mentioned earlier, one, they're the things that actually can set the land bid. So these have a material impact on your build costs. So it's like an outline building specification. But importantly, they're the things that also, if you engage local people, local builders, local conservation officers, they're the things that can make buildings local. So they're the things that out in Hampshire, you might decide to use a small amount of flint and brick, or in the Cotswolds, stone, etc. Very important when you write these rules and these codes that you do engage developers and builders, because what you don't want to do is set the standards so high and unachievable, particularly in areas of low value, that you're basically setting unrealistic standards. So this is almost a translation from the types that people like into contemporary build standards, which is terribly, terribly important. This is also then the ingredients. So this is like the ingredients of the recipe, and this is a cross-section through a street. So obviously you get the street, you get the setback, which is we call that public thoroughfares. There's then the private frontages, which is the boundary between the ownership boundary and the setback. There's then the building type, and then there's the block typology, which deals with servicing in the back. So here we go. A is therefore all of the things to do with street widths, parking standards, verges. This is really useful because if you work with the county or authorities on this, you essentially get pre-adopted street and parking layouts. So when you go to write your code, you've got as good as reserved matters. This appears in the manual for streets because we also gave highways a language from more formal to less formal. So at the bottom you can see a formal square and then something that's less regular as an informal square. And we think this language from formal to informal is important because highways are a key part of that. This is then the setbacks. So you can see at the top left, front gardens, fence front gardens, and then bottom right, sort of retail uses, arcades, awnings, shop fronts, etc. So this is the setback of the building from its ownership boundary line. This is very important and often an area that gets overlooked in coding. This is then our lexicon of building types. So again, top left, a more formal commercial building, bottom right, a less formal muse building or a lane, and somewhere in the middle, reasonable sort of series of terraced homes. Again, just setting out standards. Again, as you can see from the London Black Act, here we're not trying to show people the details of the buildings, we're just showing proportions. So floor to ceiling heights, proportions, window to wall ratios, that kind of thing, and leaving it relatively style neutral so that it can be dressed using local materials and more minimal or more embellished architecture, depending on preferences. And then there's the block typology. This is really just how you park and service bins, things like that, in the backs of the blocks in the private area. The process, I won't go into too much because I'm already at 15 minutes, but this is, again, how you put it together. So let's say on a town or an urban extension of 7,000 homes, you're going to be chunking off a phase that's usually between 300 and 500, 600, 700 homes. You give that chunk, that particular site here, to a consortium of, let's say, 3 developers. And the first thing they look at is the movement hierarchy. So they know that in that area, they've got a bit of high street in red, they've got Northern Avenue and Southern Avenue in orange, and then they've got secondary and tertiary streets in yellow and green. And the rules for those streets are different, but because we've already pre-agreed the standards with county highways, they're good to go in terms of just allocating a particular hierarchy of street. Of course, mixed use is very important in this phase. It's very much on the crossroads in the town centre. So the developers know that they've got to deliver a relatively high proportion of mixed use. This is really important. You can probably see east-west. There's a hedgerow. It's actually a watercourse running through the development. This is really where you make character judgments. So towards the park edge or on the main street, you might do something that's more formal and more urban, whereas on that watercourse, you might choose to do something that's more rural and less formal, which means that the buildings will relate to each other in a less formal way. And again, I won't bore you with too much detail here, but these are, you remember as you're old as me, the recipe cards, which you used to get. This is essentially the recipe for a more formal street and a less formal street, a crescent, and then on the right, you can see essentially this very similar house types, double-fronted houses that are identical, but the colours are variable. This is important and similar to what the car industry is doing now in terms of sharing lots of parts, but giving the purchaser lots of choice. Is that this essentially means that if you unlock the permutations and combinations through the code, you can actually get infinite variety. I mean, millions of permutations and combinations. And using BIM and other sort of models, you can cost each street accurately, but know that you can get a lot of variety from a very, very simple set of kitted parts, if you like. So I think this is maybe a bit that hasn't yet been unlocked in mixing technology and computers with town making and town character. So essentially your regulation, your code is like that. Each one of those streets has got a street card, a street regulation, and essentially it just sets out plot boundary lines. So it's incredibly, in theory, it's an incredibly simple method. And this is a more formal street. This is Linden, Bovis and Taylor Wimpey producing this. And again, a less formal street, smaller scale public space, variety in scale of streets. And again, a more formal edge. This is the 200 hectare country park you can see with some paired villas marching their way down that street to create, to use the value that obviously is going to be created when the park is planted. This, just as a reminder, is Cranbrook, the same 2 house builders just down the road near Exeter, and a different code, and so a different, I would argue, different set of results from different set of codes. Again, a few minutes now on Newquay. So the last one was private sector, if you like. This is with a long-term landowner, the Duchy of Cornwall, who have a model whereby they use SME builders and take a long-term view on values. Again, we wrote a pattern book. This was engaging the local community fairly heavily. We asked the local community to help us design or define the 5 essential qualities of place, which obviously in Newquay is quite interesting because it's quite a unique place. Then we have a series of things that we go off and study with the local community. So urban pattern, building typology, so elevations and building elements, doors, windows, eaves, and then town and landscape patterns, so boundary treatments. And again, I won't go into too much detail, but we're studying the degree of repetition or not and components in particular streets. Here you can see lanes, which are often single-sided, very different boundary treatments, proportions of buildings and building facades, hierarchy of building materials, which is obviously gives part of the character. Colours, very importantly, that we found that there are seaside colours, and then inland the colours mute a little bit, so it's very specific. Local people love telling you about all these specific details. And then the boundary treatments are obviously very important. So, and we even did a pattern book for particular types of plants, because in seaside locations it's quite specific. And here are some of the new streets. This is a street that's just been moved into. Again, you can see the Cornish hedge on the right, a very key part of its character. As you can hopefully see, very, very simple buildings, really. These are not expensive buildings. We're talking about, you know, sales values of between 220 and 250 pounds a square foot. So these are tight margins. The Cornish hedge using local Cornish slate. Again, a new street, mixed-use building there. It's an office building with apartments above, slightly more deco-y. Again, local people love that in a seaside location. Buildings that are more expensive, like using local stone, it's more expensive than the render, use on sort of key vistas to maximise the value. And last slide, really coming up now, the mix of uses. Of course, with the code, you can actually define those ground floor uses. And again, with the Duchy, we have a model of one job per household. So the idea with 4,000 homes is there'll be 4,000 jobs on site, and they're remarkably popular, these ground floor units. So that's really it. Just a few takeaways. We think it's very important when writing design codes to properly engage communities in helping them tell you about their place. Very importantly, engage builders, because they know what build costs are, materials, what's available, supply chains, very important. Keep it simple. We've written some codes that are a bit too complicated and they turn everybody off and get people confused. So just focus on 6 or 7 key building types and make sure you can enforce. The Duchy of Cornwall enforces through land covenants. Unfortunately at Sherford, the consortium submitted a section 73 and planning was too weak to enforce the code. So again, there's a massive implication of how you actually enforce codes. So thank you very much, and I hope that was useful.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben. A really succinct summary. You could probably have talked another 20 minutes about other aspects of it, but I'm glad that you've done it in the time you said you would. Quite a few questions coming up, and I think one of the earlier questions I'd like to just sort of bring to the fore was that we're obviously trying to look at how design codes might apply more widely. So are there limits to the application of design codes? How do they work in an urban environment? And the type of developments you generally showed were sort of more urban extension, greenfield. So how does it work in a higher density area? How does it work for small infill? Can you apply the same rules?
Yeah, good question. I mean, what I think of in an urban setting and maybe a one-off brownfield location is it almost is like a development brief. So you can certainly write design codes. And I know for Chelsea Barracks we were involved with, for instance, Michael Squire will tell you the codes were a nightmare because he wanted to move the building back 1-2 feet and it was already set. So I think you have to be careful writing rules when you're on tight brownfield sites, because you know, when you're dealing with a large greenfield urban extension, like I've mentioned, there's a lot more flex in the system. So the rules, you know, can be a bit, there's more room for maneuver on brownfield tighter urban sites. You have to be careful setting too rigid rules, and ultimately, you know, the context often writes the rules for you. I think from my perspective, where the codes are really useful is trying to raise the default setting of volume house building. So I think, you know, to my mind, we maybe ought to have a debate about, you know, what are the codes trying to enforce and where are they really useful? And then what type of code do we mean? So I think codes can be incredibly useful, raising the default setting on the bar for volume house building, you know, because it's a repetitive industry anyway. It's just, in most people's opinion, not very good repetition.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I totally agree with that in terms of the what we're trying to address. But clearly, in a rules-based system, there would be expectation for wider application. But we'll pass on that one for now. On the issue that keeps coming up also is about the balance between prescription and being flexible. So we hear a lot about sort of vague aspirations in codes, open to exploitation, and can be watered down. How do you build in that flexibility to respond to change over time? Because very often these codes make quite a difference. And I wonder, I mean, a specific question came up about what did you learn from doing things on Upton, where you seem to have had the results that you wanted? And are there sort of things that should be transferred to other schemes that you might have learned from that project?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, and people always refer to the sort of style issue, which I think is important. And at Upton, hopefully I showed that there's a range of styles that were all meeting that initial code before it was diluted. And it's about early engagement with the development team. I think if you engage the development team and said, let's try and start simple, let's take your 5 or 6 basic house using phase, and now work through getting those really good, and then start relatively simple on the first phase, and then have an open book review. I think the danger is if you set the rules, as you'll know, Andy, and anyone that's been in development, you generally speaking don't have a clue what things are going to cost to build because you haven't got your supply chain sorted yet. You don't really know when you start on a project. You have no real idea what if you're trying to build a better product, what your sales values are going to be, because the red book valuation will be based on whatever detritus there is down the road. So, sorry, I'm being a bit unkind, but that's quite often what it is. If you're trying to do a better product, the comparators are relatively thin on the ground. And so you really don't know where to set the standards, particularly with the building materials. So my view was, if you have a place setting phase of, let's say, 50 to 150 homes, you do a proper open book with the local authority and engage the local community, you've actually got something to kick. Again, keeping it simple. Then you can make adjustments, because you can say, well, do we need in Cornwall to use Cornish slate? It's incredibly expensive. Could we use a black clay tile on half the buildings or even 2/3 of the building? Those boundary treatments are expensive. They're lovely. To me, it's a very, very practical exercise. It's about everyone having something to kick and all standing in front of it and saying, how can we make this better? How can we build it, more frugally, but not lose the design quality? If anything, make the design quality better. And that rarely happens. The whole thing becomes so complicated and abstract with words that are vague about nice places and local identity. They don't really mean anything. When you actually get down to standing in front of a building, looking at the costs and seeing whether you can make it look better, then I think, it becomes a valuable exercise.
Yeah, that's a good point. But we, in our discussions about how we influence schemes, we talked about mood boards, and somebody threw up their hands in horror at the thought of mood boards, which often set rather vague aspirations without being specific enough. I'm getting quite a few comments about the need for simplicity. Andrew Taylor has sort of emphasised that point, and it's come up before. So how do we keep it really simple and arrive at the barest bones of what makes places? And I think you've sort of highlighted that really well. But I just as an architect that's worked in housing for 30, 40 years, how do you make sure that style doesn't become almost a fixed sort of feature of design codes? How do you create the ability to be innovative, flexible? And I take your point about what you did on Upton, but are there sort of ways in which you can, through coding, ensure that architects coming up with innovative schemes are not constrained in some way by formula or pattern book?
Yeah, so I think the two things that matter to me, or in having through those codes, is materials and a hierarchy of materials, a palette of materials that's appropriate to now, not appropriate to 300 years ago, and they're related to local supply chains if possible, and proportions, which is proportions of streets and proportions of buildings. Because if you look at whether it's a contemporary or a more traditional building versus a volume house builder, you often get very mean little windows. I think I showed that one example of Cranbrook. I mean, the window to wall ratio. And it really affects the living quality. I mean, particularly with COVID, people are really, non-architects are starting suddenly to talk a lot more about quality of space, proportion of space. It really matters. You can have a very frugal, not very big footprinted building with good volume to it and good proportion windows with low sills. And it matters. So whether you make that stripped down in more contemporary in style, or you give some window detail, it matters that the proportions matter, the quality of the build matters, and the materials matter. And largely speaking, if you're doing a more stripped down building, then you need to focus more on the materials because you really see the materials more. Traditional architecture obviously developed because you hide the cracks, so to speak. All of those little details like cornices and sills, and they hide the mistakes. So I would say go contemporary by all means, but at least make sure you get your materials, really right, and because you will focus your eye much more on the textures.
I quite liked a comment that's just been made by Melissa about break clauses in design codes. So if something comes along which stands out or is different and creates a sort of an accepted enhancement to the design code, that it should be embraced.
Sorry, just on that point, Andy, I think all codes should probably have breaks in specific areas, key points where it doesn't have to conform to the code. I think the code is trying to deal with the 70% of the general, which can vary obviously in style, but it really wants a degree of coherence, but ultimately you want to break it up. You don't want the whole thing to be too coherent because it just gets boring.
Yeah. I see there's a question about how you can expand design coding to become more national. And there might be a sort of something behind that question around the National Model Design Code, which, just to sort of explain, is not in itself a code, it's a rule book of codes. And it's like to be a sort of template for local authorities to use in different circumstances. So in case the questioner was wondering what we meant by national, that is sort of the definition of our National Model Design Code. It's a template, effectively. And we would expect all local authorities to be using it to create local design codes. So it's a bit of a question for you, Ben, in terms of who do you think is better placed to develop codes? Clearly, we expect councils to do more of this. You've been working for landowners and developers. How do we get more councils doing this sort of work?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Because I think there is a capacity issue. I mean, there will need to be. It is a relatively skilled job writing code, but I think ultimately it should be done ideally between developers in an area, the local authority and the local community. And if you can bring those three into balance via workshops where you've got a template, the way I see it, as you explained, is the National Design Code is sort of templates and refers you to processes and methods of creating these things, then ideally you engage people in telling you about their place, helping to set the standards. And again, without sounding like a broken record, I really do think builders, local builders particularly, and people like conservation officers who understand good buildings in the local area are important, but so too are commercial developers, because you want to try and pick the best bits of a place, but then make sure they're absolutely suited to their setting. So the images I showed of Mansledden, there were far fewer slate-hung buildings than you find in reality. Well, that's because it's really expensive. So we don't use slate hanging, on one or two key buildings, same with Burton, and the majority of it is much cheaper, sort of rendered buildings. So there's got to be a reality check on costs and values.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're coming towards the end. I'd like to have asked you a question about whether you think design codes, would you do something different as a consequence of the pandemic? And are there any new rules that you think we ought to be thinking about? Or is that just good practice? And maybe you could do that in 30 seconds before I wrap up.
Well, ideally it's good practice, but there's a reason why 3 to 4 bedroom houses are selling a lot. I don't deal with the insides, but proportions of windows really key, and links to outdoor space like green corridors, proximity to parks, gardens is really, really important, and widths and proportions of streets. So I think not being mean with elevations, windows, light and quality of natural light in the natural environment really matters.
Totally get that, and maybe that's something we can be thinking about as we move forward. I'd like to thank all the questions and questioners. Sorry if I haven't answered all your questions. Thank you very much, and off you go to Secretary of State's speech. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.